In the summer of 1994, the town of Maple Hollow, population just under 7,000, was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, routines, and secrets, or at least they thought they did. It was the kind of community where the local grocery store displayed trophies from high school football games, where Friday night meant church fish fries, and where any child's success was celebrated as if it belonged to the whole town. In those days, no one shined brighter than 8-year-old Lily Ann Carter. She was small, with a gap-toothed smile, and the kind of confidence that seemed to defy her age. People called her the darling of Maple Hollow, and it wasn't an exaggeration. She had won 3 regional child beauty pageants in just over a year, appeared in commercials for a local boutique, and had been featured in the state newspaper after taking home a trophy in a statewide competition. Lily had become a fixture in the community. Someone's niece, someone's student, someone's neighbor's little girl. Everyone had watched her on stage, twirling in sequined dresses under hot lights, and they had all clapped for her as if she were their own. The night before she vanished, she'd been at the Maple Hollow Founders Parade with her mother, Elaine, and her 6-year-old brother, Trevor. The event was a yearly tradition, the main street lined with folding chairs and coolers, the smell of kettle corn and grilled sausages mixing with the faint exhaust of antique cars rolling by. Witnesses remembered Lily sitting atop her mother's shoulders at one point to get a better view of the marching band, waving her little hand at the floats as they passed. Several people recalled seeing her later that evening at the ice cream stand, a chocolate cone in one hand, her other hand holding Trevor's as they walked back toward their car. The Carter family lived just 5 minutes away, in a modest 2-story house with white siding and green shutters, and by all accounts the night ended without incident. According to Elaine, they returned home shortly after 9. The children were ushered upstairs for baths, and Lily insisted on brushing her hair before bed, something she'd been particular about ever since she started competing. She picked out a pastel nightgown with tiny flowers on it, kissed her mother goodnight, and was last seen climbing into bed with her favorite stuffed bear tucked under one arm. Elaine would later say that nothing about that night felt unusual. There were no strange cars parked outside, no suspicious phone calls, no sounds that hinted anything was amiss. She turned in herself just after 11, her bedroom on the opposite side of the hall from her children's. When morning came, the world in the Carter household had shifted in a way that would never be undone. Elaine woke first, the light creeping in through the blinds, and went to check on Trevor and Lily. Trevor's bed was rumpled, his small form curled, under the blankets. But Lily's bed was empty. The sheets were pulled back, her pillow on the floor, and the window above her desk sat slightly ajar, letting in the damp morning air. A wooden chair, usually pushed neatly under the desk, was tipped over on its side. Elaine later told police she didn't scream, at least not right away. She walked the room, calling her daughter's name, half expecting Lily to pop out from a hiding spot playing some early morning game. But there was no answer. When she went downstairs, panic began to bloom in her chest. The front door was still locked from the inside. The kitchen was untouched. Trevor, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, said he hadn't seen or heard anything. Elaine ran to the neighbors, knocking frantically, asking if they'd seen her daughter, and within minutes, the quiet street was alive with activity. Neighbors spilled out into yards, calling Lily's name, checking backsheds, scanning the edges of nearby woods. One man grabbed his bicycle and rode up and down the street looking for any sign of the girl. Another woman called the local police. The first patrol unit arrived in under 20 minutes. By the time officers stepped into the Carter home, the atmosphere had shifted from worry to something heavier. The tipped chair, the open window, and the absence of any sign Lily had left willingly all spoke to something darker than a game of hide and seek. An officer noticed the damp impression of a small bare foot on the floor near the window, as if Lily had stepped there recently. The screen from the window was on the ground outside. A light scrape mark trailed down the siding below it. These details were enough for police to treat the situation not as a case of a wandering child, but as a possible abduction. They ordered the family and neighbors to stop searching and began securing the perimeter of the home. Officers taped off the yard and started canvassing door to door, asking if anyone had seen an unfamiliar car or person overnight. Some neighbors mentioned a faint engine sound in the early hours, but nothing specific enough to pursue. A K-9 unit was brought in to track Lily's scent. The dogs followed it down the street, past 3 houses, and then abruptly lost it near an intersection where tire marks cut across the damp grass. Investigators would later note that this was likely where a vehicle had been parked. In those first critical hours, the search spread outward. Wooded areas combed, drainage ditches checked, even dumpsters behind the grocery store inspected. Every minute that passed deepened the fear that Lily wasn't just missing. She was gone in a way that meant she might never be coming back. And in a town where everyone thought they knew each other, the possibility that someone in their midst had taken her would mark the beginning of suspicion that would never truly fade. The first 2 days after Lily Ann Carter's disappearance were a blur of sirens, strangers, and questions that no one could answer. Detectives from the county sheriff's department arrived before noon, their unmarked cars lining the curb in front of the Carter home. By then, the house had shifted from a family's private space to an active crime scene. Officers moved deliberately from room to room, documenting every surface, collecting fingerprints from doorknobs and window latches, photographing the tipped chair and the slightly open window in Lily's bedroom. Outside, yellow tape fluttered in the light breeze, cutting the Carters off from the steady trickle of neighbors who came offering casseroles, flashlights, or simply the comfort of company. From the start, investigators worked under the assumption that someone had taken Lily. That meant looking first at the people closest to her. Elaine Carter was interviewed twice that day, once at her kitchen table and again at the station. She explained every detail she could remember about the night before: the parade, the ice cream stop, the bath, the bedtime routine. But one part of her account drew quiet attention from detectives. She mentioned a heated conversation with a pageant organizer in the moments before they left the event. Elaine said it had been about scheduling conflicts, nothing more. Still, it was noted in the case file. Lily's father, David Carter, returned home within hours after being reached by police. He was a long-haul truck driver and had been 2 states away when his daughter vanished. Detectives asked him to account for every hour of his trip. His employer confirmed his delivery logs matched his statements, but the questioning was intense. In missing child cases, investigators know that the perpetrator is often someone known to the family, and they were determined to either confirm or rule out that possibility early. Beyond the family, attention turned to Lily's coaches, photographers, and the regular faces at the beauty pageants. While the community saw pageantry as a source of pride, law enforcement understood its darker reality. Lily's photographs were all over local newspapers, event flyers, and even regional television spots. Anyone with an unhealthy interest would know her face, her routines, even where she lived. Detectives began compiling a list of attendees from recent competitions, checking names against local offender registries. As interviews continued, small fragments of memory began to surface from the neighborhood. 2 residents reported seeing a dark sedan idling near the Carters' driveway on the night of the parade. One thought it was black, the other dark blue. Neither could identify the driver, but both placed the car there sometime between 10 and 11 p.m., a time when Lily was already supposed to be asleep. Another neighbor remembered hearing a car door close softly, though they couldn't recall the exact hour. None of it was concrete, but together it began to form a faint outline of something planned, deliberate. Hoping. For a break, investigators set up a command post at the local community center. Volunteers gathered to help distribute missing person flyers, each bearing Lily's smiling school portrait, her name printed in bold letters beneath the words, "Have you seen me?" Local businesses taped them in their windows, church groups handed them out at Sunday services, and stacks were left at gas stations and grocery store counters. At the same time, deputies coordinated with the highway patrol to establish temporary roadblocks on the main routes in and out of town, stopping cars, showing drivers Lily's photo, and asking if they'd seen anything unusual. K-9 units were brought back for a second attempt to track Lily's scent. Starting from her bedroom, the dogs followed a trail through the backyard, along the sidewalk, and down the street. They passed several houses before abruptly stopping near the intersection by the old bus stop. Handlers tried to restart the search, circling the area, but the scent was gone. Investigators believed this was where Lily had been taken into a vehicle, possibly the same dark sedan reported by neighbors. Despite the urgency, there was no ransom note, no phone call, nothing to indicate the abduction was financially motivated. That absence only deepened the sense of dread. With no clear suspect, the investigation widened. Officers visited nearby motels, checking guest logs for unfamiliar names. They pulled security tapes from gas stations, hoping to spot the sedan. Patrol units combed the roads leading out of town, some extending their search into neighboring counties. By the end of the second day, the Carter family's living room was crowded with boxes of donated food, stacks of flyers, and a growing collection of stuffed animals and flowers left by neighbors. Elaine sat quietly in a corner, a photo of Lily clutched in her hands, while David stood by the front window, staring at the street as if willing his daughter to appear. Outside, the street lamps flickered on, casting pale light over the yard where police still moved between cars. The urgency of the first hours had given way to a grim, focused determination. Every lead mattered, but for now, the one that stood out was the simplest and most troubling, the trail ending at the bus stop, swallowed by the night. As the search for Lily Ann Carter stretched beyond the first frantic days, detectives turned their attention to a world that, until then, had been seen by most in Maple Hollow as harmless, a world of glittering tiaras, sequined dresses, and bright stage lights. The child beauty pageant circuit had been Lily's second home, but to investigators, it also represented an arena where strangers could gain easy access to children under the guise of harmless admiration. They began by compiling rosters of recent events, speaking to organizers, makeup artists, and photographers. Almost immediately, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Several adult men had been noted attending pageants in the past year without accompanying children. They were often seen with cameras, lingering at the edges of the stage, blending into the background. One name stood out early: Mark Fuller, a local photographer in his late 40s, known in the community for his work at sports events and weddings. Fuller had been arrested 3 years earlier for trespassing on private property while photographing a group of neighborhood kids playing in a park. Though the charges had been dropped, the incident remained on record. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he was calm but guarded. He claimed he had been working at a high school graduation the night of the parade and insisted he hadn't seen Lily since a pageant 2 weeks prior. His alibi was partially verified. Several people remembered him being at the event, but there was a gap in the timeline late that evening that he couldn't fully explain. Without concrete evidence linking him to Lily's disappearance, police had to release him. The interviews with Lily's circle of friends brought another chilling detail into focus. One of her closest pageant friends, a girl the same age, told investigators something she had overheard just days before Lily went missing. They had been in the dressing area during practice when Lily whispered that she didn't want to go to the next practice because someone keeps watching me. When asked to elaborate, the friend said Lily wouldn't name the person, only that it wasn't someone from her immediate family. Detectives pressed for more, but the girl's recollection was hazy. She'd been distracted by getting ready for her performance, and the comment hadn't seemed important at the time. Now, it hung over the investigation like a shadow. Digging further, police collected hours of footage from past competitions, official event recordings, local news clips, and even amateur videos posted by parents. They watched them frame by frame, scanning the background for any figure who seemed to appear too often in too many different cities and venues. That's when they spotted him. In at least 4 separate events, there was a man wearing the same dark baseball cap. He was never front and center, never interacting directly with Lily on camera, but always positioned where he had a clear view of the stage. Sometimes he was leaning against a wall, other times seated casually in the back row. His posture was relaxed, his attention unwavering. Efforts to identify the man began immediately. Still frames from the footage were distributed to local and state agencies and even circulated quietly among pageant organizers in neighboring states. But no one seemed to recognize him. He wasn't listed as a volunteer, vendor, or staff member for any of the events. His presence in multiple towns suggested he might be traveling, perhaps following the pageant circuit without drawing attention to himself. Detectives couldn't prove he had any contact with Lily, but the frequency of his appearances raised the unsettling possibility that she had been singled out long before the night she vanished. In trying to map connections between Lily's public appearances and the timeline of her disappearance, investigators found that the parade had been advertised in several of the same circles as her pageants. It wasn't inconceivable that someone who'd seen her on stage could have learned where she lived simply by following her after an event. That theory shifted the investigation's tone. This wasn't just a child who happened to be taken from her home. This could have been a calculated act, months in the making. Despite the unease that theory brought, no hard evidence tied the baseball cap man to Lily's case. Leads from the circulated images led to dead ends, men who vaguely resembled him but had verifiable alibis. The frustration inside the task force was mounting. The sense that they were circling someone who had slipped just beyond their reach was palpable. And as the community clung to hope, the knowledge that Lily herself might have sensed she was being watched gave the investigation a haunting personal edge. It was no longer just about finding out who could have taken her. It was about finding the man whose presence in her world had gone unnoticed until it was too late. By the third week of the investigation, the flood of tips that had once kept the phone lines ringing around the clock had slowed to a trickle. Every promising lead seemed to collapse under the weight of dead ends, and the sense of urgency that had driven the search in the first days was being replaced by something heavier, an unspoken fear that Lily's trail had gone cold. Detectives decided it was time to go back to the beginning, back to the place where it had all started. The Carter home had been searched on the morning of her disappearance, and again in the hours that followed. But this time the approach would be different. It would be slower, methodical, and intrusive. Nothing would be left to chance. Officers arrived just after dawn, armed with new warrants and specialized equipment. Every surface was examined, every closet emptied. In Lily's bedroom, a crime scene technician leaned close to the window frame and noticed something that had been missed before. 2 tiny fibers caught in the wooden edge where the paint had chipped. They were pale in color, almost white, and too fine to have come from the household curtains. Each one was carefully lifted with tweezers, sealed in a vial, and logged as potential evidence. Outside the same window, faint scuff marks ran down the siding, the kind that might be made by the sole of a shoe or the rubber edge of a ladder. They were subtle, almost erased by weather, but visible enough to suggest movement from the window to the ground. The discovery shifted the theory of the case. Where once it had been uncertain whether Lily had left the house voluntarily or been taken, the fibers and scuffs made the possibility of forced entry far more real. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline with the assumption that someone had physically entered her room and removed her, unseen, in the hours after she went to bed. It was a chilling scenario, one that would have required precision, confidence, and perhaps familiarity with the layout of the home. During the expanded search, an officer suggested checking the attic space, even though it had been glanced over in the original sweep. A small, folding ladder was pulled from the hallway closet, and 2 officers hoisted themselves up into the cramped, dusty space. The air was heavy with insulation and the smell of old wood. A quick scan revealed nothing. No footprints in the dust, no disturbed boxes, no signs that anyone had been there recently. The search moved on. At the time, the attic was ruled irrelevant, a dead end in a house that was already beginning to feel like a maze of unanswered questions. Meanwhile, suspicion had begun to settle, however quietly, on the family itself. David Carter's alibi had been checked and rechecked. His employer confirmed his long-haul trucking route, and several way station logs placed him hundreds of miles away that night. Still, his frequent absences from home and his quiet, guarded demeanor during interviews made some in the community uneasy. Rumors trickled through Maple Hollow, whispered at grocery store checkouts, and passed between neighbors over back fences. Some claimed the Carters weren't telling the full story. Others suggested they might have known the person responsible. For Elaine, the speculation was salt in an already open wound. She stopped going to the local market altogether, relying on relatives to bring groceries to the house. To keep momentum in the investigation, police decided to release a composite sketch of the man in the baseball cap spotted in multiple pageant videos. The image was drawn from hours of footage, interviews with event staff, and enhancements of still frames. It showed a man in his 40s with an angular jaw, narrow eyes, and a cap pulled low over his forehead. Within hours of its release to the public, the tip line was swamped. People from across the county, and eventually across the state, called in to say they recognized the man. But with each promising lead came the inevitable collapse. One was a hardware store clerk with no connection to the case, another a delivery driver who had never attended a pageant. Some were pure misidentifications, while others were deliberate fabrications from people looking for attention. By the end of the week, detectives were back where they had started. Fibers without a match, marks without a suspect, and a face that existed in sketches and blurry frames, but not yet in reality. The Carter home, once filled with Lily's laughter and the clutter of everyday life, had become something else entirely. A monument to the moment. She vanished, and a reminder that even within the walls meant to protect her, someone had found a way in. Within a month of Lily Ann Carter's disappearance, the story had grown beyond Maple Hollow. What had begun as a desperate local search was now being covered by national morning shows, news magazines, and syndicated talk segments. Producers leaned on the image that had made her a familiar face in town, her beaming school portrait and clips of her twirling in a pageant gown, casting her as America's little star. Interviews with Elaine ran alongside footage of candlelight vigils, her voice breaking as she begged for her daughter's return. For a while, it felt like every corner of the country knew Lily's name. With the attention came an avalanche of tips. The phone lines at the sheriff's department were staffed around the clock, each call recorded, each one logged. Anonymous sightings poured in from every direction. Someone swore they'd seen her at a gas station 3 towns over, standing by the ice freezer while a man bought cigarettes. Another caller claimed to have spotted her in the corner booth of a roadside diner in Kansas, eating pancakes with a woman in sunglasses. The most dramatic came from a carnival worker in Missouri who insisted a girl matching Lily's description had been walking with a man near the ticket booths just 2 nights earlier. Officers followed up on every report, sending faxes with her photo, dispatching local police to question staff, and reviewing grainy security tapes. Each time the answer was the same. It wasn't her. The crush of false leads didn't just slow the investigation, it began to fray its edges. Resources were stretched thin, and detectives found themselves chasing down rumors instead of building on solid evidence. In the midst of this chaos, a self-proclaimed psychic from out of state contacted the Carters, insisting she had seen visions of Lily close to home. Elaine, desperate for anything that might bring her closer to her daughter, agreed to meet her. The psychic walked through the house, pausing in the hallway outside Lily's bedroom, murmuring that she could feel her presence. She pointed toward the attic and repeated that Lily had been nearby for longer than anyone realized. Detectives privately dismissed it as theatrics, but Elaine clung to the idea, unable to shake the hope it stirred. A more tangible lead surfaced when a tipster reported seeing a traveling handyman in the neighborhood in the weeks before Lily vanished. He had been working odd jobs, roof repairs, gutter cleaning, mostly for elderly residents. The description was vague but matched a man who had briefly stayed at a low-budget motel on the edge of town. Detectives tracked him down in another county, only to find that his time card from a construction site hundreds of miles away cleared him entirely. Another promising thread cut short. As summer turned to fall, the media cycle shifted. News stories replaced Lily's on the evening news, and the flood of calls slowed to a trickle. Without fresh developments, the spotlight dimmed. The search efforts became quieter, more private. The Carters organized a candlelight vigil on the 1-year anniversary, lining the steps of the courthouse with flickering lights and framed photos of Lily. Neighbors, teachers, and former classmates came, but the crowd was smaller than the family had hoped. The following year, they held it again, and again after that, each time with fewer attendees, though Elaine never failed to show, holding a candle in one hand and her daughter's picture in the other. Inside the house, the absence settled in like an unwelcome tenant. David grew more withdrawn with each passing year, speaking less to reporters and even less to friends. He spent long hours in the garage, tinkering with tools, avoiding the living room where Lily's trophies still stood in neat rows. Trevor, who had been too young to fully grasp what happened at the time, began waking in the middle of the night screaming. He couldn't always explain what the nightmares were about, only that they involved someone at the window. Doctors called it night terrors, a stress response to early trauma. Elaine wondered if somewhere deep down he remembered more than he could say. By the time the third anniversary approached, the investigation had no active leads. The case file was thick, the evidence box sealed and shelved, but nothing pointed clearly to what had happened that night in 1994. What remained were fragments: a window left ajar, scuff marks on siding, a man in a baseball cap no one could name, and the relentless ache of not knowing. And though the cameras had long since moved on, the Carters' front porch light still burned through the night, a small, stubborn signal that they had not stopped waiting. By 1997, 3 long years had passed since the night Lily Ann Carter vanished, and the case had transformed from an urgent manhunt into a haunting file tucked away in the sheriff's department archives. The binder of reports had grown thick, pages of interviews, tip logs, forensic notes, and maps, but nothing in it offered a clear path forward. Evidence boxes, each labeled with her name and case number, sat stacked in the department's storage room, their cardboard edges softening with time. The officers who had once stood in the Carter living room making promises to find her had moved on to other assignments, their places filled by new faces who knew Lily's story only from the grainy photographs in the file. For the Carter family, time had not dulled the absence, it had only deepened it. Inside the house on Maple Hollow's east side, Elaine Carter had preserved Lily's bedroom as if freezing it in the summer of 1994. The bed was always made, its floral quilt smoothed perfectly over the mattress. Her trophies and ribbons still lined the shelf above the desk, each one polished, their metallic surfaces catching the light. Dresses from past competitions hung neatly in the closet, some still carrying the faint scent of hairspray and perfume. The room felt untouched, yet heavy, more like a shrine than a place where a child once slept. Elaine dusted it weekly, refusing to pack away a single thing, as if keeping it ready for Lily's return might somehow make it happen. Life outside their home had shifted in subtle but telling ways. The neighbors who had been part of the frantic first searches began moving away. One family that had lived directly beside the Carters for over a decade sold their house that winter. When their property sat empty for a few weeks, it opened an unobstructed view of the Carters' side yard from the street, something that hadn't been possible in years. Elaine didn't think much of it, but to a trained investigator, the change altered the way the house could be observed, the angles from which it could be approached. It was around this time that Detective Ryan Harlow, newly transferred into the department, began reviewing cold cases as part of his rotation. He was only in his early 30s, but meticulous in his approach, combing through old files with a patience that others sometimes found tedious. When he reached the Carter case, he noticed small gaps in the original reports. Nothing glaring, just inconsistencies in how certain areas of the property had been searched. Notes from the first days referenced the attic only briefly, describing a limited inspection with no notable findings. Harlow marked it with a question, not because he believed it held the answer, but because he knew in cold cases the smallest overlooked detail could sometimes unravel everything. His review of photographs taken during the initial search also caught his attention. In some images, the window in Lily's room was documented from the inside, but never from a direct angle outside. The scuff marks noted years later were absent from these early shots, not because they weren't there, but because no one had photographed them up close at the time. This wasn't negligence, just the reality of a frantic investigation unfolding under immense pressure. Still, it meant there were elements of the original scene that had never been preserved the way they should have been. Harlow requested the evidence boxes from storage and spent an afternoon going through them piece by piece. There were photographs of the fibers collected from the window frame, the composite sketch of the man in the baseball cap, transcripts of interviews with neighbors, and even hand-drawn maps from the K-9 tracking sessions. As he worked, a picture formed in his mind, not of the night itself, but of the investigation's progression. It was clear that once the initial leads dried up, the case had become reactive, chasing tips rather than proactively re-examining the physical environment. By the time he closed the last box that evening, Harlow had decided to do what no one had done in nearly 3 years. Go back to the Carter house in person, walk through every room, and see it with fresh eyes. He knew it would be invasive, and he knew the family had endured more than their share of visits from police, but he believed they might understand if he explained his reasoning. If nothing else, he wanted to verify that every corner of the home had truly been searched the way the reports claimed. When he knocked on Carter's front door 2 days later, Elaine looked surprised but let him in. As she led him through the familiar rooms, he noticed how little had changed, how time seemed to have stopped in that space. But when he reached the hallway outside Lily's bedroom and looked up at the small square hatch in the ceiling, he paused. It wasn't just that the attic had been ruled irrelevant all those years ago. It was the fact that no one had ever documented what was in its farthest reaches. Standing there, staring at the closed hatch, Harlow felt the first stirrings of a question he couldn't yet put into words, one that would soon lead him back into the darkest corners of the house. Detective Ryan Harlow returned to the Carter house with a plan that was as simple as it was painstaking. Search every inch of the property as if the original investigation had never happened. It was a crisp morning in early March of 1997 when he arrived with 2 other officers and a pair of evidence techs. Elaine Carter watched from the kitchen as they moved methodically from room to room, their voices low, their hands gloved. The attic, the space most easily dismissed in the early days, was near the bottom of his checklist. But when he finally stood beneath the narrow hatch in the hallway ceiling, he felt the quiet weight of it pressing down. According to the case file, it had been inspected visually in 1994, nothing more. He unfolded the ladder and climbed into the space, the wooden rungs creaking under his weight. The beam of his flashlight cut through thick dust, catching the jagged edges of insulation and the wooden crossbeams overhead. At first glance, it was unremarkable. Boxes of holiday decorations, an old trunk, a plastic storage bin stacked with yellowing photo albums. But Harlow didn't stop at the obvious. He lowered himself onto the plywood boards and began crawling toward the farthest reaches of the attic, the corners where the roof dipped low and the insulation lay undisturbed in uneven mounds. Every movement sent fine particles into the air, the smell of dry wood and fiberglass heavy in his lungs. Near the far corner, something caught the light, a rounded shape peeking through the insulation. He brushed it aside and uncovered a small ceramic cereal bowl, its surface dulled by years of dust. The design around the rim was faded but still visible. Cartoon animals marching in a circle. A matching plastic spoon rested inside, its handle yellowed with age. For a moment, he thought it might be a forgotten toy set, something misplaced long before the family moved in. But when he leaned closer, the truth set in. The bottom of the bowl was lined with a crust of dried residue, the unmistakable remnants of milk and cereal flakes, hardened into a brittle layer. Harlow felt the shift in the air around him. He didn't call out immediately. Instead, he slid an evidence marker from his pocket, placing it beside the bowl, and signaled for the techs below. As they joined him, their expressions mirrored his own, confusion tinged with unease. Items like this didn't belong in a rarely accessed attic, and certainly not in a case where a child had vanished from her bedroom. The insulation was carefully pulled back, each movement documented. Beneath where the bowl had been resting lay a single long hair, pale brown, almost blonde. It clung to the dust, undisturbed until the moment it was lifted with tweezers and sealed into an evidence envelope. Forensics testing was rushed. Within days, the hair was confirmed as a match to Lily Ann Carter. The bowl and spoon were also identified as coming from the Carter kitchen, part of a set Elaine had purchased at a local department store when Lily was 4. When confronted with the findings, Elaine was visibly shaken. She insisted she had never stored anything in the attic, let alone food. David Carter's reaction was quieter, but just as firm. He couldn't explain how it had gotten there. Neither could offer a reason why their daughter's hair would be found next to it, tucked into the farthest, least accessible corner of their own home. The discovery reframed everything investigators thought they knew. The working theory shifted from an abduction that began outside the home to something far more disturbing, that Lily may have been hidden in the house itself, at least for a time, after she disappeared. The condition of the cereal remnants suggested they weren't recent, but forensic dating was imprecise. All it confirmed was that the milk and flakes had been there for years, possibly since the summer she went missing. The layout of the attic made the scenario chillingly plausible. It was large enough for someone to sit or crouch in that far corner, out of sight from anyone making a quick scan. From there, the faint sounds of the house below, the creak of stairs, the slam of a door, would have been audible. If Lily had been brought up there during the initial search, she could have been hidden in plain sight, shielded by the very structure meant to protect her. But the implications were almost too much to process. For that to be true, someone would have needed access to the house during those critical first hours, someone who knew the attic was rarely checked. Could the abductor have entered while searchers combed the neighborhood? Could they have returned later, after the family and police left a room unattended? The possibilities unsettled even the most seasoned detectives. When the media caught wind of the attic discovery, the case surged back into the public eye. Reporters fixated on the eerie image of the dust-covered bowl, calling it the attic clue. Headlines speculated wildly. Was the cereal given to comfort a frightened child, or to keep her quiet? Talk shows debated whether the abductor had been inside the home longer than anyone realized. Elaine refused most interview requests, but in one brief statement to a local paper, she said, "If it means she was here after we thought she was gone, I don't know whether that's a comfort or a nightmare." The attic was searched again, this time inch by inch, but no other physical evidence was found. There were no fingerprints on the bowl or spoon. Time and dust had erased them. No footprints in the insulation that could be matched to a shoe size, just the objects themselves, mute and incriminating in their strangeness. For Harlow, the discovery was a turning point. It was proof that something in the original search had been missed, but it also raised questions no one could answer. If Lily had been in the attic, how long had she been there? Who had put her there? And how had they managed to leave no trace beyond a single hair and a forgotten bowl of cereal? Those questions would haunt the investigation long after the day the insulation was pulled back, revealing a clue that should never have been there at all. The discovery in the attic rippled through the community like a shockwave. Within days, the image of the dust-covered cereal bowl and plastic spoon appeared on news broadcasts across the country, each anchor repeating the same haunting fact, that it had tested positive for Lily's DNA. The public fascination with the case, dormant for years, roared back to life. Talk radio programs dissected the find in real time, debating what it meant. Some saw it as proof that Lily had survived for a period after she vanished, hidden somewhere no one had thought to look. Others saw something darker, a suggestion that her abductor had moved through the Carter home with chilling confidence, perhaps even while searchers were still combing the neighborhood outside. For the investigation, the attic clue was both a gift and a curse. On one hand, it was physical evidence, something tangible in a case built on fading memories and dead ends. On the other, it opened a dozen disturbing possibilities. One of the most unsettling theories was that Lily had been concealed in the attic during the very first police sweep. The search of that space in 1994 had been cursory at best. If someone had pushed her far enough into the corner and covered the area with insulation, she could have been overlooked entirely. The presence of the cereal suggested she had been fed, which meant she had likely been alive for at least some time after disappearing from her bed. Whether those hours turned into days remained unknown. Detectives also considered the possibility that the attic had been used as a temporary holding place while the abductor waited for the right moment to leave the house. In that scenario, the most disturbing question wasn't how Lily got into the attic. It was who had carried her there and how they had moved through the home without anyone noticing. The Carters' house had been filled with people in the first hours, officers, neighbors, family members. Could someone familiar with the layout have slipped inside during the chaos, climbed up, and then back out unnoticed? The thought was enough to make veteran investigators uneasy. The theory inevitably casts suspicion back toward the family. If Lily had been in the attic after she was reported missing, it implied someone in the household, or someone with access, had played a role. Detectives re-interviewed Elaine and David Carter, probing timelines and rechecking their alibis. Elaine's reaction to the attic discovery had been one of shock, but investigators noted that she also seemed deeply unsettled by the idea that her daughter might have been so close without her knowing. David remained mostly quiet in public, but insisted to police that the attic had never been used for storage beyond the boxes of decorations. Without any additional evidence, suspicion couldn't move beyond speculation, but whispers began circulating in Maple Hollow again. Some neighbors quietly admitted to reporters that the find made them question things. Beyond the immediate circle, the re-emergence of the case drew in a new wave of attention from outside voices. Amateur sleuths, emboldened by the rise of online forums in the late 1990s, began trading theories and scanning archived articles for inconsistencies. Old details were dragged back into the light, none more than the composite sketch of the man in the baseball cap. The image, which had generated hundreds of tips years earlier, was scanned and posted online, sparking a flurry of renewed speculation. Users claimed to have spotted men matching the description in other unsolved cases, though none of those connections were confirmed. Some amateur investigators fixated on the timing of the parade and the fact that it had been advertised in the same circles as Lily's pageants. They argued that the baseball cap man could have learned her address by following her from a previous event, giving him the knowledge needed to approach the home without arousing suspicion. Others believed the attic clue proved a second person was involved, one to take her and another to hide her inside the house while attention was focused elsewhere. Law enforcement found themselves in the difficult position of sifting through this flood of public theories, while knowing that the attic discovery, for all its implications, didn't actually bring them closer to identifying the person responsible. The cereal bowl and hair told them Lily had been there, but not when and not with whom. Without fingerprints, eyewitnesses, or other trace evidence, the find was more haunting than conclusive. Still, the renewed attention breathed life into the stalled investigation. Local media began running weekly segments revisiting key moments in the case, interviewing former officers and pageant staff. A handful of tips trickled in. People who claimed they'd seen a man with a cap and camera at other child-centered events in nearby towns. Detectives followed up, but the leads once again dissolved under scrutiny. The baseball cap man remained a ghost, present in grainy footage but nowhere else. For Elaine, the attic discovery left her with a tormenting thought she couldn't shake. If Lily had been in that space after the night she vanished, had she called out? Had she heard the footsteps of searchers moving below? And if she had, why hadn't anyone heard her? The answers were buried under layers of dust, insulation, and years of silence. By the close of that year, the frenzy around the attic clue had begun to cool, but the questions it raised lingered. Theories continued to circulate, some plausible, some wild, but none could be proven. The cereal bowl sat sealed in an evidence locker, a quiet, stubborn reminder that in the most critical hours of the search, the truth might have been hidden just overhead, out of sight and out of reach. The attic discovery had reignited the case in the public eye, but weeks passed without any new, actionable leads. Then, in late autumn of 1997, a call came into the sheriff's department from a man living 2 towns over. He introduced himself as a former handyman, said he'd been following the recent news coverage, and that something about the attic clue had triggered a memory he couldn't shake. Back in the summer of 1994, just a few weeks before Lily disappeared, he had been hired to repair shingles on the Carter's roof. It was a small job, half a day's work, but partway through, while carrying tools through the hallway, he saw a man emerge from the attic hatch. The handyman described the man as being in his late 30s or early 40s, medium build with dark hair and a slight stubble. He wore work boots and a faded flannel shirt, and when he noticed the handyman watching, he said he was just checking the wiring. It seemed casual enough at the time. The handyman assumed he was a relative, maybe helping the family with some home repairs. The moment was brief, just a passing encounter in a busy day, and until now, it had never occurred to him that it might be important. Detectives listened carefully. The detail was unlike anything else in the case file. In 1994, no one had reported seeing a stranger in the home before Lily's disappearance, much less coming from the very space where her hair and cereal bowl would later be found. But when they pressed for more, the handyman's recollection faltered. After 3 years, the edges of the memory had worn thin. He couldn't recall the exact day, couldn't describe the man's eye, color, and wasn't even certain whether he had carried any tools or equipment. He was sure, however, that he had never seen the man again. Investigators compared his description against every person of interest from the original investigation: the pageant photographer, the traveling handyman who'd been cleared, and of course, the unidentified baseball cap man. None matched cleanly. The man he remembered hadn't been wearing a cap, and nothing about his clothes fit the known suspects. They expanded the search to include old contractors, electricians, and relatives of the Carters, but the trail was too cold. Employment records had been lost or destroyed, addresses were outdated, and some potential witnesses had moved away entirely. Hoping to at least confirm whether the attic had been accessed during that period, forensic specialists were brought in to analyze the insulation and dust patterns. Using methods that could only estimate time frames, they determined that the far corner of the attic, the same spot where the bowl had been found, had been disturbed sometime in the mid-1990s. It wasn't exact science, but the results aligned with what investigators now feared. Lily had almost certainly been in that space after she disappeared. The implications were crushing. If the handyman's account was accurate, it meant that someone unaccounted for had not only been inside the Carter home before the abduction, but had direct, unobserved access to the attic. It was possible the man had been staking out the space, preparing it, or even using it in ways the family never realized. That would explain the eerie comfort of the cereal bowl, food brought for someone who was never meant to be found. But with no name, no photographs, and only a faded recollection to go on, the lead stalled. The handyman, frustrated, apologized repeatedly for not coming forward sooner. Detectives told him it wasn't his fault. Memories only sharpen when new details bring them into focus. But they couldn't ignore the bitter truth. If this tip had been reported in 1994, when tracks were fresh and people's faces could be placed with certainty, it might have been the break they needed. Now it was just another shadow in a case built on them. In the end, the lead was written into the file and marked as unresolved. It joined the list of haunting maybes: the baseball cap man, the dark sedan, the scuff marks, and now the stranger emerging from the attic. Each pointed to the same grim possibility, that Lily Ann Carter had been closer than anyone realized, hidden above the heads of those who searched for her, while the person responsible walked away unseen. The lead about the stranger in the attic had flickered like a match in a dark room, then burned out just as quickly. Without a name, a photo, or a traceable connection, investigators could do little more than file it away with the rest of the case's lingering maybes. And so the momentum, once again, bled out. The task force dedicated to Lily's disappearance was quietly dissolved. Detectives were reassigned to other cases. The attic cereal bowl, sealed in its evidence bag, sat in a locked cabinet at the county sheriff's department, its chain of custody sheet marked with fewer and fewer signatures as the years went on. For all its eerie weight, it told them nothing new. In Maple Hollow, the Carter home became a place people talked about in lowered voices. After the 3rd anniversary of Lily's disappearance, David and Elaine put the house on the market. Officially, they said it was because they couldn't bear the memories, but everyone understood there was more to it than that. Every creak of the floorboards, every glance toward the attic hatch, carried the unspoken question of what had happened in that space. They bought a smaller house on the far side of town, closer to Elaine's sister, and quietly moved out one rainy afternoon in 1998. The property sat vacant for months, the for sale sign leaning slightly in the wind. Potential buyers came to look, but didn't stay long. Some admitted later they had recognized it from the news and couldn't imagine raising a family there. Eventually, the listing expired, and the bank took it back. Over time, the once proud white siding dulled to a tired gray. Weeds crept up along the front steps, and ivy began to claim the side walls, windows clouded with grime. Inside, dust settled thick on every surface. The attic, with its dark corner and its unanswered questions, remained untouched. Local kids, especially teenagers, began daring each other to go inside. The dares were never about stealing or vandalizing, though the occasional window pane was cracked. They were about testing courage. The story had taken on a life of its own. They called her the attic girl now, whispering that if you stayed too long in the house at night, you could hear her footsteps overhead or the faint clink of a spoon against a bowl. None of them knew the exact details of the case, but the cereal bowl was legendary, an object that seemed too strange, too ordinary, to fit cleanly into the grim reality of an abduction. For Elaine, leaving the house hadn't brought peace. She kept the front page of the newspaper from the day the attic clue was revealed folded neatly in a shoebox, along with Lily's birth certificate, her last school report card, and a lock of her hair saved from her first haircut. David retreated even further into himself after the move, taking long overnight drives even when he didn't have to. Trevor grew into a quiet teenager, avoiding questions from classmates about his sister and never speaking about the years in the old house. The case remained officially open, if only in name. Once a year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the sheriff's office would issue a short press release stating that they still welcomed tips. Most years, no calls came in at all. Occasionally, a stranger would send a letter claiming to have seen Lily in another state, or that they knew who the baseball cap man was, but every claim unraveled under investigation. Each one chipped away at the hope that the truth was still within reach. By the early 2000s, the Carter house had become part of Maple Hollow's folklore. Stories about it were told at sleepovers and around campfires, shifting with each retelling. The details blurred. Some versions claimed police had found a whole cache of belongings in the attic. Others said the family had hidden the cereal bowl themselves. But in all of them, the attic was the center, the place where something unspeakable had happened just out of sight. Inside the sheriff's department evidence room, the bowl remained exactly as it had been found. Its cartoon animals were barely visible now under the fine scratches on the glaze, its handle brittle with age. The hair, sealed separately, was still labeled Item Number 46, Lily Carter confirmed. Detectives who had worked the case and since retired would occasionally stop by to see it, as if hoping that staring at it might unlock some buried insight. But the object offered no answers. It was mute, stubborn, and final. New investigators coming into the department would read the Carter file as part of their cold case orientation. Many came away unsettled, not just because of what was in the file, but because of what wasn't. There were no crime scene photos of the attic before the insulation was disturbed, no time-stamped proof of exactly when that corner had last been touched before 1997, no definitive link between the bowl and any suspect. In a case defined by near misses and unanswered questions, the attic clue was the most haunting of them all because it confirmed one terrible truth without explaining the rest. Lily had been there. Years later, the house was finally purchased by an out-of-town investor who intended to renovate it for rental. The work crew who came in stripped wallpaper, replaced carpet, and repainted the siding. One of them, unaware of the home's history, opened the attic hatch and remarked on how cramped and dusty it was in the far corner. Another, who had grown up in Maple Hollow, told him to leave it alone. That was the attic girl's spot, he said, and nothing good would come from messing with it. No one was ever arrested for the disappearance of Lily Ann Carter. No new physical evidence was recovered after the attic search. The cereal bowl remained the last tangible sign that she had existed beyond the night she was reported missing. It sat in the evidence locker like a frozen fragment of time, a reminder to investigators that sometimes the most damning clues come too late to make a difference. And so the case endures, a wound that never closes. The Carters eventually left Maple Hollow altogether, moving to another state where their names and faces weren't recognized in grocery store aisles. But in the town they left behind, The east house still stands, its roof repaired, its walls repainted, its windows replaced. To most, it's just another aging rental property. But to those who remember, it will always be the place where a little girl vanished into the dark and where, years later, a single bowl of cereal was found sitting in the attic, silent proof that she had been closer than anyone dared imagine while the truth remained just out of reach.